Welcome to Sleep Stories by Oliver Penn. I am your host, and you have found your way here at exactly the right hour. This is a place built for the end of the day, for the moment when the world outside finally quiets, and something softer is permitted to take its place. Before we begin tonight, I would be glad to know where you are listening from. Leave a word in the comments if you like. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different corners of the world are settling into the same story at the same hour. If you find rest here, consider subscribing. New stories arrive regularly, and there will always be a lamp lit and a chair waiting. Now, set everything down. Whatever the day has left behind, let it wait until morning. It will keep. Make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes if you are ready, and take one slow breath. Tonight, I will take you somewhere unhurried, somewhere the light is always amber, the rooms are always warm, and the night outside is always still. All you need to do is listen. The train from London arrived at Harrogate at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning in May, and Florence Wray stepped onto the platform into air so different from London's that she stood still for a moment simply to receive it. Cool and clean, and carrying, beneath the ordinary station smell of coal smoke, something green and living that she could not immediately name, but that settled around her like a kind of permission. She had not been to Yorkshire before. This was, if she considered it from the right angle, one of the more remarkable facts about her situation, that she was travelling to take up a position in a county she had never visited, in a house she had never seen, with a family she had met only through a letter of introduction and 2 subsequent exchanges of correspondence, the whole arrangement conducted with the brisk efficiency of people who had need of a governess and were satisfied she would do. She had not asked many questions. This was partly her temperament, which tended toward careful observation rather than advance inquiry, and partly the practical reality of her situation, which was that she needed the position and could not afford the luxury of excessive caution. A governess without employment was simply a woman without income, and Florence, who had been managing without the assistance of family since the age of 18, understood the arithmetic of this with the particular clarity of someone for whom the arithmetic had never been theoretical. The family was the Ashworths, Mr. Gerald Ashworth, a solicitor, and his wife Margaret, with 2 children, Eliza, 9 years old, and Thomas, 7. Greywood Hall was described in the solicitor's initial letter as a comfortable family property some 3 miles from Greywood village in the Yorkshire Dales. The position required teaching the children in the mornings and supervising their afternoons, with evenings and Sundays her own. It sounded, on paper, like any other such position. Florence had held 2 before this, both in London, both in the careful, slightly airless way of London's professional households, where the governess was a necessary piece of furniture rather than a person with any particular interior life. She had performed both positions competently, and had been sorry to leave neither of them, which was, she supposed, either a comment on the positions or on herself, and she had not yet decided which. She found the trap that had been sent from Greywood Hall, a neatly kept vehicle with a young driver who confirmed her name and loaded her trunk with the careful efficiency of someone for whom this was a routine errand, and they set off northward through the Yorkshire morning. The landscape opened as they left Harrogate behind, fields and walls, and the slow rise of the moors in the distance, and Florence sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched it come. The hawthorn was in full flower along the lane, white blossoms crowding every hedge, the smell of them reaching her even inside the trap, something between sweet and sharp, the particular abundant smell of May in the countryside. She had seen hawthorn in London parks, 1 or 2, carefully managed. She had never seen it like this, every hedge white with it, the whole landscape in what she would later learn the locals called simply the Blossom, as though there could be no other. She watched it pass and felt, without quite understanding why, that something was beginning. The house appeared at the end of a long straight lane of old beech trees, and Florence saw it for several minutes before the trap reached the gates, a long grey stone building, 2 stories, with a slate roof and chimneys, and a particular solidity that spoke of having stood in exactly this place for a very long time without finding any reason to apologize for it. It was not the grandest house she had seen, nor the most beautiful, but it had something she could not immediately name, a settled quality, the quality of a place that had accumulated sufficient history to have found its own character, independent of any particular design intention. The gardens visible from the lane were in full May bloom, and this softened the grey stone considerably. The walls of the house barely visible in places beneath the wisteria that had clearly been growing there for decades, its lavender clusters hanging heavy and fragrant, moving slightly in the warm May air. Mrs. Crane met her at the door. She was a woman of perhaps 64, small and upright, in the plain dark dress of a long-established housekeeper, with white hair arranged with economical precision, and grey eyes that took Florence in with a single comprehensive look, and, apparently, reached whatever conclusion was needed and filed it away without further comment. "Your room is ready," Mrs. Crane said. "Mrs. Ashworth will see you at luncheon. The children have their lessons in the schoolroom, 3rd door on the right at the top of the stairs, beginning at 9 each morning and finishing at noon." Florence thanked her and was shown upstairs by a housemaid who moved with the practiced quiet of someone who had been moving through this house for years and had ceased to notice it as anything other than a series of known distances between known points. The room was at the end of the upper corridor, small but south-facing, with a window that looked directly out over the walled kitchen garden and beyond it to the open meadow field, and, in the middle distance, a section of the ornamental garden she could not yet fully see, only the top of something that might be a rose arch, and the bright May green of a well-kept lawn. She stood at the window for some minutes after the housemaid had gone, letting the room settle around her. A governess's room had a specific quality she had learned to read quickly across 2 previous positions, whether it had been prepared with any real attention or simply cleared and reoccupied with the same furniture that had always been there, the minimum provision of a space the household considered adequate for the purpose. This room had been prepared. There were fresh flowers on the windowsill, small and undemonstrative, and the bookshelves contained actual books rather than the overflow from other rooms, and someone had thought to put a comfortable chair near the window, which was either policy or kindness, and which Florence, in her experience, was the same thing. She unpacked her trunk with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this many times and had developed a system for it, and found, when everything was in its place, that the room already felt somewhat more hers than entirely unfamiliar, which was better than she had expected on a first day. Below the window, in the kitchen garden, something was flowering. She could see the color from here, small blue flowers in a bed near the wall, but she could not have said what they were. She was not, in any meaningful sense, someone who knew the names of flowers. She would learn this later. She woke the following morning to birdsong. Not the thin, scattered birdsong of London, present but always at a remove, mediated by rooftops and traffic and the general noise of a city that never entirely slept. This was immediate and various and entirely unfiltered, coming through the open window she had left ajar the previous night because the May air was so much cleaner than what she was accustomed to that sleeping in it felt wasteful, and arriving now in the early morning with a complexity and volume she had not anticipated. She lay still and listened. She could not identify a single species by its call, which was a measure of how thoroughly a London childhood had sealed her off from exactly this kind of knowledge. She knew, in the general way of someone who had read about such things, that different birds made different sounds, and she understood that the melodic insistence coming from the garden below was probably something she should be able to name. She could not name it. She resolved, without quite knowing why, to find out. The morning light in the room was pale gold, the particular early May gold of the sun, still low in the sky but already warm. The quality of light that came with long days only just establishing themselves after the contractions of winter and early spring. It lay across the floorboards in a wide rectangle and moved slowly as she watched it. The movement of something unhurried, something that understood it had all day. She dressed and went down to breakfast in the servants' dining room, where Mrs. Crane sat at the head of the table, with the stillness of someone whose authority in this space required no particular assertion, and where the other household staff made room for her with the polite, calibrated distance that domestics always showed a governess, not quite one of them, not quite one of the family, a known category of person to be treated with specific, if somewhat uncertain courtesy. The children came to the schoolroom at 9 precisely. Eliza was dark-haired and direct, with the quality of a child who has been sufficiently attended to that she expects the world's attention as a matter of course, and who was assessing Florence with the frank interest of someone who has had governesses before and found them variable. Thomas was smaller and quieter, with a watchful quality about him that Florence recognized from somewhere in her own past as the quality of someone who observes carefully before committing. She taught them through the morning arithmetic and French and a reading exercise from a volume of natural history selected from the schoolroom shelves, chosen partly because it was there and partly because the illustrations were excellent and the children responded to excellent illustrations. By 11 o'clock she had a reasonable understanding of what each of them already knew and what they did not, and by noon she had a sense of how to approach the weeks ahead that felt, if not entirely confident, at least adequately grounded. After luncheon, which she took with the children in the small dining room adjacent to the schoolroom, she had the afternoon to herself. Mrs. Ashworth had made this clear in her initial letter, that the governess's afternoons were her own time to use as she found suitable. She found the library. She had not been explicitly invited to use it, but she had not been told not to, and Florence had learnt across 2 previous positions that the absence of prohibition generally constituted sufficient permission for someone in her situation, whose official existence in the household occupied a position between guest and employee that was rarely defined with the precision it warranted. The door was unlocked. The room beyond it smelled of old paper and linseed oil and something faintly floral she could not identify. She stepped inside. The library at Greywood Hall was a large room by the standards of a family house of its size, 2 walls entirely given over to shelves, a 3rd wall occupied by 3 tall windows facing the garden, and the 4th by a fireplace currently unlit, before which 2 armchairs sat at comfortable angles as though recently occupied and merely temporarily vacated. The books were arranged with the particular logic of a collection that had grown organically across generations, not by subject or by alphabet, but by some accumulated domestic sense of what belonged near what. The large natural history volumes together on the lower shelves, the poetry in a run along the upper section of the left wall, novels interspersed with what appeared to be family histories and estate records, and the occasional volume of sermons that had presumably been important to someone at some point and had never been moved since. Florence walked slowly along the shelves, as she had always walked along shelves in any room with books, which was to say with the particular unhurried attention of someone for whom books in any form represented a kind of reliable company, regardless of their specific content. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was simply learning the room. The 3 windows gave onto the garden in the particular way of large windows in old houses, the glass slightly uneven, old enough to have acquired the faint greenish tint of age, the view through them therefore slightly softer and more impressionistic than modern glass would have produced. The May garden beyond rendered in the manner of something between a painting and a photograph, the wisteria on the far wall, and the rose beds in their May state of full beginning, visible but somehow made more beautiful by the gentle distortion of very old glass. She reached the end of the right-hand wall and turned to the large oak table that occupied the room's center. It was a working table rather than a decorative one, the surface slightly marked with the rings of cups set down over years, with the occasional ink stain of someone who had written letters or worked through correspondence at it, with the general accumulated evidence of genuine use rather than careful preservation. She noticed the drawer almost by accident, a handle slightly different from the table's other hardware, on the left side slightly ajar, not locked, not sealed, simply not quite fully closed, as though someone had reached for something inside it recently and had not pushed it shut afterward. She looked at it for a moment, then she pulled it open. Inside was a single book, large, perhaps 12 inches by 9, bound in dark green leather worn soft at the corners and the spine, the cover showing the kind of patina that accumulates only through decades of handling, the particular darkening of leather that has been touched and opened and closed many times by hands that cared about what they were touching. No title on the cover, no name, simply the green leather, worn and quiet, lying in the drawer as though it had been placed there carefully rather than abandoned. She lifted it out, which required both hands because it was heavier than it appeared, and carried it to one of the armchairs by the unlit fireplace. The May afternoon light came strongly through the 3 windows, full and warm and sufficient. She sat down and opened the book on her lap. The first page held a pressed flower, mounted on cream paper with a fine adhesive, and beneath it, in small careful handwriting, a card. Hawthorne, May the 3rd, 1838, North Meadow, near the wall. I did not expect the year to begin well, and it has not, but the hawthorn has come out anyway, without asking my permission, and I find I am grateful. Florence read this, and then read it again. Then she looked at the flower, a small spray of white hawthorn blossom, dried flat against the cream paper, the petals still holding their shape after 37 years, the color faded to cream, but the structure perfectly intact, every petal preserved in the particular faithful way of things that have been pressed with sufficient care and kept in sufficient darkness. She turned the page. The second flower was a single stem of wild violet, pressed with the same care as the hawthorn. Its purple, or what had been purple, now faded to a soft grey lilac, spread flat against the cream page, the leaves arranged on either side as they might have grown, as though whoever had pressed it had wanted to preserve not just the flower, but the particular way it held itself in life. The card beneath it read, Wild Violet, April the 21st, 1840, from the bank beside the South Lane. James was in Leeds this week. The house was very quiet. I walked every morning and found that the quiet was not as difficult as I had expected. Florence held the book more carefully, understanding now that she was holding something private, not private in the sense of forbidden exactly, since the drawer had been ajar and unlocked, and the book had plainly been here for years without being removed or locked away, but private in the sense that its contents had been written without any particular expectation of being read, in the manner of things written for the writing's sake rather than for any audience. She read on. The third flower was something small and yellow she did not recognize, and the card read, Tormental, June the 7th, 1840, High Moor, above the north pasture. Found it while I was looking for something else entirely. I have been thinking about what it means to find what you are not looking for, and whether it is better or worse than finding what you were. The writing did not vary across these early pages in any dramatic way. The same small, careful hand, the same unhurried composure. But she noticed, moving through the entries from 1838 forward, a quality that she might have called truthfulness if she had been putting it into words, which she was not, because she was simply reading. The notes said what they said without elaboration, and without the kind of careful management of impression that Florence had observed in most written communication she had encountered in her life. The letters of employers and the notes of parents and the professional correspondence of a person trying to appear a certain way. These notes appeared to be the communication of a person trying to be accurate. She turned the pages slowly, pausing at each pressed flower before reading the note, trying to learn the flower first before learning what its collector had said about the day she collected it. She had no botanical knowledge with which to identify most of what she was looking at, but she found she could observe them, the shape of the petals, the number of them, the way the stem was preserved, the presence or absence of leaves, with the same quality of attention she brought to anything she was trying to understand. Meadowsweet, July the 12th, 1841. From the stream bank at the bottom of the east field. James has been unwell, nothing serious, but I found I did not know what to do with my worry. I picked these because the smell of them is the smell of something that has decided to be itself completely, and I thought it might help. It did, somewhat. Florence read this twice. She thought about the word somewhat, the careful qualification of it, the refusal to claim more comfort than had actually been received. She thought about whoever had written it, standing at a stream bank in July, with meadowsweet around her knees and a worry she did not know what to do with, and deciding that the smell of the flowers was the correct response to at least some portion of it. She read until the light through the tall windows began its slow May decline toward evening, and found, when she finally closed the book and sat for a moment with it on her lap, that she had not been in any hurry for the afternoon to end. She asked Mrs. Crane about the book the following morning, finding her in the corridor outside the linen room with the brisk purposefulness of someone who has a great many things to accomplish before luncheon and is proceeding through them in order. Mrs. Crane stopped when Florence asked, and turned and looked at her with the particular expression that Florence was coming to recognize as her default assessment mode. Not suspicious exactly, but deliberate, the expression of someone who receives information carefully before deciding what to do with it. "You found the library book," she said. "It was not a question." "It was in the drawer of the oak table," Florence said. "The drawer was open." "I hope I have not." "You haven't," Mrs. Crane said, in the tone of someone cutting off a sentence that did not require completion. "It belongs there. It has always been there." She paused, and something in her expression shifted very slightly from deliberate to something more careful, the expression of someone approaching a subject they have held privately for a long time and are selecting their words accordingly. "It was Mrs. Ashworth's," she said. "Not the present Mrs. Ashworth, the previous one, Mr. Gerald Ashworth's mother, Catherine. She kept that book from when she first came to Greywood Hall as a young woman until the year she died." Florence thought about the dates. The first entry had been 1838. How long ago did she die? 1868, Mrs. Crane said. 7 years ago, she was 48. Florence held this arithmetic for a moment. 30 years of entries. 30 springs and summers of pressed flowers and small honest notes, conducted quietly in a house where she had been daughter-in-law, wife, mother, eventually grandmother, all of those public roles running parallel to the private practice of the book. Did she know you knew? Florence asked. Mrs. Crane looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied similar territory. I'd been in this house for 5 years before I understood what the book was, she said. I found it once, when I was cleaning the library. She'd left it out. She saw me looking at it and she said, "It's just a record I keep." And I said yes, and left it at that, because it was clearly not just a record she kept, and we both knew it, and there was nothing else that needed to be said. She keeps flowers? Florence said. Kept, Mrs. Crane said, past tense. She picked them herself, pressed them herself, wrote her own notes. She never showed the book to anyone as far as I know. She never spoke of it. She just kept it. For 30 years, Florence thought about this for a long moment. The corridor was quiet around them, the morning household sounds muted here on the upper floor, only the distant clatter of the kitchen reaching them, and, from somewhere outside, the resumed birdsong she was beginning to find familiar, even without yet knowing what it was. What happened to her? Florence asked. You said 48. Her heart, Mrs. Crane said simply. She had known for some time that it was not strong. She managed very well for many years. In the last year she was slower than she had been, and she knew it, and she said once that she intended to finish what she had started, and I understood her to mean the book, though she didn't say so directly. She died in September of 68. The book was in the drawer, where it has stayed since. Did the family know she kept it? I believe they knew she pressed flowers, Mrs. Crane said. Whether they knew the rest of it. She paused. I think it was hers. I think she kept it for herself, and it remained hers. Florence thanked her and went upstairs to the schoolroom, carrying with her the particular careful weight of a piece of knowledge that has been given to you by someone who held it privately for a long time and is not sure, even now, whether the giving was entirely right. She returned to the library each afternoon. She had not discussed this with anyone, had not asked Mrs. Ashworth's permission, had not mentioned it to Mrs. Crane beyond their single conversation about the book's provenance. She simply went, in the way that one returns to a place where something has begun and not yet concluded, without requiring explicit sanction for the continuation. The book was always in the drawer, exactly where she had left it. She carried it each time to the same armchair by the unlit fireplace. The fire was unnecessary in May, the room warm enough by afternoon, and read with the windows open, the May garden audible behind her, the birds and the occasional sound of the gardener working in the rose beds, adding their presence to the room without intruding upon it. She read slowly, as the book required. Each spread of pages held one flower, one note, and sometimes a second note beneath the first, in a slightly different hand. The same hand, Florence had come to understand, but written at a different time, as though Catherine had returned to certain pages to add a thought that had arrived later, after the original day, an amendment to the record. Cowslip, May the 17th, 1843, from the upper meadow near the ash tree. The children were very loud today, and I was not patient. I came here afterward and picked these, below this, in the smaller, more cramped hand of an edition. Read this in 45 and thought how ungenerous it is. They were not very loud. I was simply tired and gave it the wrong name. Florence read this and sat with it for a while, thinking about what it meant to return to your own words 2 years later and find them ungenerous, and to correct them in the same book rather than simply allowing the original version to stand. There was something in this practice of revision, the willingness to hold yourself accountable to your past self, to note the places where you had been less than accurate, that she realized, genuinely moving. The middle years of the book, the 1840s and 1850s, had a settled quality to them, the notes less self-examining than the early ones, carrying instead the particular texture of someone living at full pace, the entries shorter, the observations more outward-facing, the flowers including things from the kitchen garden and the park, and occasionally from further afield, a note indicating a journey or a visit. Heather, August the 3rd, 1849. From the high moor, above Coldmoor. We walked there today, all four of us. James carried Edmund for the last mile. I pressed these at night when everyone was asleep, which is the only time I have in August. Florence thought about the image. Catherine pressing Heather at night while her family slept, the house quiet around her, this small private practice continuing in whatever time the rest of her life permitted. Primrose, March the 22nd, 1856. From the South Bank, first of the year. Edmund left for school today. I have been told I will grow accustomed to it. I suppose I will. She turned the pages and followed Catherine Ashworth across 18 years of springs, through the particular variety of ordinary life, its small joys, its manageable losses, its recurring seasons and recurring flowers, and found, reading it with the full attention of a May afternoon and all the unhurried time that afforded her, that she was being given something more than the record of one woman's botanical observations. She was being given the particular close-grained texture of a life as it had actually been lived from the inside by someone who had understood from the beginning that the only record worth keeping was the honest one. On the fourth morning, Eliza asked Florence if she liked flowers. They were in the schoolroom, between arithmetic and French, and Eliza had the quality she always showed in these transitional moments, a bright, opportunistic attentiveness, the particular readiness of a child who understood that the intervals between lessons were the most promising territory for questions of a more interesting nature than the lesson itself. I think I am beginning to, Florence said, which was true in a way she could not have explained to a 9-year-old without reference to the book, whose existence she had not mentioned to the children. There are very good ones in the garden, Eliza said. Mrs. Fenn knows all their names. She's the head gardener. Florence filed this information for later use and began the French lesson. But she thought about Mrs. Fenn that afternoon as she walked in the garden for the first time, not the walled kitchen garden visible from her window, but the ornamental garden on the south side of the house that she had not yet properly explored. May had brought Greywood Hall's garden to what was evidently its best season. The rose beds were in first bud, not yet fully open. The wisteria on the garden wall had passed its peak, but was still fragrant, and everywhere she looked, something was either in flower or about to be, the whole garden in a state of barely contained abundance that gave her the sense of having arrived at the exact right moment. She found Mrs. Fenn near the herb border at the garden's far end, a practical, compact woman of perhaps 50, with the particular weathered quality of someone who worked outdoors in all conditions and had reached a settled understanding with the weather that involved neither complaint nor excessive optimism. Florence introduced herself and asked, directly, because she had found that directness worked better than indirection with people who dealt in concrete things, whether Mrs. Fenn might be willing to teach her the names of some of what she was looking at. Mrs. Fenn looked at her with a brief, appraising expression. What do you know already? Very little, Florence said honestly. Mrs. Fenn appeared to find this an acceptable starting point. She led Florence slowly along the herb border, naming things as they walked: lavender, rosemary, thyme, the different varieties of mint, and then along the rose beds, where nothing was yet fully open but the bud forms were already distinctive, each variety identifiable before it bloomed if you knew what you were looking for. Florence listened with the concentrated attention she had brought to every kind of learning throughout her life, filing each name against the thing it belonged to, understanding already that the names alone were insufficient, that she would need to see each flower in multiple states and seasons before it became genuinely known to her, rather than merely identified. She asked about the forget-me-nots. She had noticed them near the garden wall, a drift of small blue flowers that she had seen from her window on the first morning and had not known the name of. Mrs. Fenn looked at them briefly. "Forget-me-not," she said. "They come back every year. You can't really stop them." She paused. "Mrs. Catherine, the previous mistress, she was very fond of them. She had that corner planted with them specially, 30 years ago at least. They've spread somewhat since." Florence looked at the corner of the garden, a little sheltered angle where the wall turned, with the stone bench she had noticed earlier positioned to face it. The forget-me-nots there were denser than elsewhere, a concentrated blue that was almost lavish, the kind of planting that comes from decades of self-seeding in a place that has found entirely agreeable. She thought of the book in the library drawer. She would look for forget-me-nots in it when she returned. She walked back to the house in the long May afternoon light, knowing the names of 11 things she had not known that morning. She found the forget-me-nots in the book on the following afternoon, not one entry but 3, spread across different years, as though Catherine had returned to them repeatedly, the way one returns to a subject that continues to yield something worth saying. Forget-me-not, May the 8th, 1846. From the corner by the south wall, the ones I planted there 3 years ago. They have spread exactly as I hoped. There is a particular pleasure in a plant that knows what it wants and proceeds toward it without requiring your continued management. Florence smiled at this, the dry approval in it, the pleasure taken not in the beauty of the flowers, though presumably Catherine had found them beautiful, but in their competence, their self-determination. Forget-me-not, May the 22nd, 1857. From Catherine's corner. I did not name it that myself, but Mrs. Fenn has started calling it so, and it appears to have stuck. I am not sure how I feel about having a corner named for me while I am still occupying it, but I suppose it is better than the alternative. Below this, in the smaller edition hand, better, yes. I was wrong to be ambivalent. Florence held the book and thought about Catherine Ashworth reading her own notes several years later and correcting her ambivalence, committing in hindsight to the feeling she had been uncertain about at the time. This habit of revision, which she had now encountered several times across the book's pages, struck her as one of the most characteristic things about its author: the refusal to allow the past self to stand unexamined, the continued willingness to look back and say, with whatever gentleness or sharpness the case warranted, "I was wrong about that." Forget-me-not, June the 2nd, 1867. From Catherine's corner, beside the bank. Eliza brought me these today, a fistful of them, without knowing why. Children always know, somehow, even when they don't know that they know. I am not well. I have not said so yet. Florence read this entry and then sat for a very long time without turning the page. She understood, from Mrs. Crane's account, that Catherine Ashworth had died in September of the following year, 1868, which meant this entry from June 1867 had been made in the final year of her life, in the period when she had apparently understood something about her health that she had not yet shared. The entry's particular quality, not fearful, not dramatic, simply accurate in the way all the entries were accurate, seemed to her, reading it with this knowledge, to hold a specific weight that the surrounding pages did not. She turned on, reading the final year of the book with the particular quality of attention one brings to the closing pages of something that is about to end. The entries in 1868 were fewer than in previous years and somewhat shorter, the handwriting in some of them less regular than Catherine's usual careful hand, as though written in circumstances that did not permit her usual composure of position. But they were present. She had continued, right through that last summer, collecting and pressing and noting, the practice maintained with the same faithfulness she had brought to it across 30 years. The last entry was dated August the 15th, 1868. Harebell, August the 15th, 1868. From the high meadow above the north wall, I had to rest twice on the way up, but the harebells were worth the resting. Florence read this final entry 3 times, and then she closed the book very gently and sat in the May afternoon light with it on her lap, and was quiet for a while. She went to Catherine's corner the following afternoon, before her customary time in the library, taking the long way around through the kitchen garden, so she arrived at the south wall from a direction she had not previously approached it from. The corner was exactly as she had seen it from a distance, the turned angle of the wall, the stone bench set at the right angle to catch the afternoon sun, the forget-me-nots dense around its base in the particular lavish blue that she had found so striking on the first morning when she had seen them without knowing their name. She sat on the bench for some minutes before she looked at the garden from Catherine's perspective, understanding this as the view that had accompanied 30 years of botanical observation. The rose beds visible from here, the wisteria wall to the left, the kitchen garden gate ahead, and above the garden wall the upper windows of the house itself, the library windows, she realized, among them. The May afternoon was warm and without wind, the particular stillness of a settled spring day that has decided to be only itself, without the distraction of weather. She could hear the birds from here, clearer than from indoors, the full variety of the May Garden's avian residents conducting their afternoon business in the trees above and the hedges along the wall, and beneath the birdsong, very faintly, the sound of the children in the upper garden, with Thomas, whose Tuesday afternoon was supervised by the nursemaid while Florence had her free time. She thought about Catherine Ashworth sitting on this bench, not once, but many times across 30 years, in many different versions of the spring and summer garden, in many different versions of the life that surrounded the bench and the corner and the book. She thought about what it meant to return to the same place across decades of a life, to have a corner that was recognizably yours, not because you had claimed it, but because you had simply kept returning to it until the returning itself established a kind of belonging. Mrs. Penn was working in the rose beds nearby, and she glanced at Florence with the particular sideways awareness of someone who notices without making the noticing pointed, and after a few minutes came closer and said, in the matter-of-fact way she said everything, that the bench needed resanding on the left leg before the summer was out, and that she expected the wisteria would need cutting back by August, and that the forget-me-nots were at their best this week, peak week. After this they'd begin to go to seed. Florence looked at the forget-me-nots and understood that what she was seeing, the full dense blue of them, the particular quality of the color in the afternoon light, was specifically and only this week's thing, something she had arrived at exactly the right moment to see, and that would be diminishing by next week and gone entirely by June. She thought about Catherine's entry. May the 8th, 1846. There is a particular pleasure in a plant that knows what it wants and proceeds toward it without requiring your continued management. She thought about what it meant to notice the peak of something, to be present for the week of fullest bloom rather than arriving a week early or a week late, to find yourself coinciding with exactly the right moment of exactly the right thing. She had arrived at Greywood Hall in the first week of May, and the forget-me-nots were at their peak, and Catherine Ashworth's corner was as she had left it 7 years ago, and the book was in the drawer where it had waited, and Florence Wray was sitting on the bench looking at all of this and understanding something she did not yet have words for, but that felt under her ribs unmistakably like recognition. Eliza found her in the garden on the 6th day. Florence had taken to sitting in Catherine's corner in the late afternoons when the weather permitted, which it had done with a consistency that suggested May in Yorkshire could be genuinely benevolent when it chose, and she was sitting there with a small notebook she had begun carrying, not for any purpose she had fully defined to herself, simply because she had found that having somewhere to write down the names of things helped her remember them. Eliza appeared around the corner of the kitchen garden wall with the direct confidence of a child who has decided something and is executing the decision, and stopped when she saw Florence and said, without preliminary, "I thought I'd find you here." Florence looked at her. "Did you? Mrs. Crane said you come here most days now." Eliza sat on the bench beside Florence, with the assumption of welcome that characterized everything she did. She always sat there too. Mrs. Catherine. Florence had not expected this, had not thought to wonder whether the children remembered Catherine Ashworth, who had died when Eliza was 2 years old. "You remember her?" she said. "No," Eliza said, with the frank acknowledgement of a child who understands the difference between her own memories and other people's accounts. "But Papa talks about her sometimes, and Mrs. Crane." She turned and looked at the forget-me-nots with the comfortable familiarity of a child who has grown up with them as simply part of the garden. "She planted those, didn't she?" "She did," Florence said. "Mrs. Crane says she kept a book," Eliza said. "A flower book. I've never seen it." Florence held this for a moment, deciding. "It's in the library drawer," she said. "I've been reading it." Eliza looked at her with the sharp interest she brought to any piece of information that exceeded her expectations of the adults around her. "Can I see it?" Florence thought about this, about what it would mean to show the book to Eliza, who was Catherine's granddaughter, who had grown up in the house where it had been kept, who had some claim to it through family connection that Florence herself did not possess. She thought about Catherine's privacy, maintained across 30 years and 7 years of death, the drawer carefully ajar, but the book still fundamentally her own. "I think you should ask Mrs. Crane about it," she said finally. "It was your grandmother's. The decision about whether to share it should come from your family, not from me." Eliza considered this with the seriousness she brought to genuinely complex propositions. "That's fair," she said after a moment, and then, without transition, "Do you know what that one is?" She pointed to a small yellow flower growing at the wall's base, tucked between the stones. "Tormental," Florence said, and then felt the particular pleasure that comes from knowing a thing you did not know a week ago, the small specific satisfaction of vocabulary genuinely earned. Eliza looked at her with surprise. "You didn't know any flower names when you came?" "I'm learning," Florence said. Eliza seemed to find this unremarkable, in the way children often found the learning of adults unremarkable, accepting the fact without requiring an explanation of why it had taken so long. She picked up the notebook from Florence's lap and looked at the list of names written in it. 15 entries now, each one gained across the days of this first week, each one belonging to something currently growing within the bounds of this garden. You should put them in the book, Eliza said, returning the notebook. Your own ones. There's blank pages at the back. I looked once when I was small. Florence looked at her. She had not yet reached the back of the book. She had been reading forward through the entries from 1838 without skipping ahead, following Catherine's accumulation in the order it had been made. She had not yet seen the blank pages. She went to the library that same afternoon, earlier than usual, and took the book from the drawer and carried it to the armchair and turned to the back. Eliza was right. After the final entry, the harebell from August the 15th, 1868, there were 12 blank pages, not torn or damaged, not the ragged ends of removed sheets, but complete, unmarked pages, as though the book had been made with more space than the 30 years of entries required, or as though Catherine had anticipated continuation beyond what she herself would be able to provide. Florence sat with the blank pages for a long time. She thought about what Eliza had said. You should put them in the book. The easy directness of a child who had not yet acquired the caution that would later make such suggestions more complicated, who saw a blank page and thought of what might fill it, rather than of what might constitute an imposition upon it. She thought about Catherine's last entry, made 6 weeks before her death, the harebells at the top of the meadow above the north wall, the twice resting on the way up, the conclusion that they had been worth the resting. She thought about the entry for the forget-me-nots in June 1867. I am not well. I have not said so yet. She thought about whether the blank pages represented intention, whether Catherine had expected or hoped that someone else would continue what she had started. The book had been in the drawer, not hidden, not locked, the drawer simply and unremarkably slightly ajar, as though access were the expected thing and privacy were simply a function of no one having thought to look. She did not decide anything that afternoon. She read back through some of the middle entries instead, finding comfort in the settled quality of the 1850s, the pages where Catherine was fully in her life rather than approaching its end, the entries carrying the particular untroubled weight of someone who does not yet know what is coming. But she found, walking back to her room as the May evening light turned the gardens green to gold, that she was thinking about the blank pages with a quality of feeling she had not entirely expected, not the reverence that would have prohibited any addition, not the boldness that would have required no further consideration, but something between the two, a careful curiosity about what it would mean to continue, if continuation were the right word. What Catherine had practiced alone for 30 years, she had nothing to press yet. This was the immediate practical reality. She could not add an entry without a flower, and she had not collected any flowers, and she had not thought, until this afternoon, that she might. She looked out her bedroom window at the garden below. The forget-me-nots in Catherine's corner were still blue in the long evening light. Peak week, Mrs. Fenn had said. After this they'd begin to go to seed. She went back downstairs, out through the kitchen garden gate, and walked to the corner of the south wall. She stood before the forget-me-nots for a moment, looking at them with the particular attention she had been developing across these days, not the attention of identification, she already knew their name, but the attention of observation, the looking that tries to see the thing as it actually is, rather than as the category it belongs to. She bent down and carefully, with the attention to stem length and petal condition that she had absorbed from watching Catherine's pressed specimens without fully knowing she was absorbing it, she chose a single small spray of forget-me-nots and took it up. She carried it back to the house. She was not yet certain what she was going to do with it, but she had it. She pressed the forget-me-nots that evening in her room, using the method she had worked out from studying Catherine's specimens, a doubled page of writing paper on either side, placed within the heaviest book her small shelf afforded, which was a volume of natural history that served its purpose, if not its intended one. She left them for 3 days, which seemed, from examining Catherine's results, to be sufficient for flowers of this size and type, though she understood she was working from observation rather than knowledge, and that the result might prove her wrong. In the meantime, she went about the daily business of the schoolroom and the afternoon garden and the library reading, the 3 activities that had, in the space of 2 weeks, become the structure of her days at Greywood Hall. The schoolroom was settling into a comfortable pattern, Eliza sharp and quick, and needing careful management of her tendency to rush through things she already knew in order to arrive at things she didn't. Thomas slower and more methodical, the kind of learner who built things securely rather than quickly, who returned to previously covered ground with a thoroughness that Florence found, in her best moments, genuinely admirable. She was, she realized, becoming genuinely interested in them as particular people rather than simply as pupils, which was, she had learned from her previous positions, both the most rewarding aspect of governess work and the most complicated one. The investment it required was real, and the knowledge that it was temporary, that she would be here for a year, perhaps 2, and then move on, created a quality in the caring that she had never found a word for, something between attachment and preemptive loss, the feeling of building something you know you will eventually have to leave. She had thought about this more clearly since reading Catherine's book. The book was full of this particular quality, the loving of things that were seasonal, temporary, that would end or change or go to seed regardless of how faithfully they were attended to. Catherine seemed to have understood this not as a reason not to love them, but as part of the nature of loving them, inseparable from what made them worth loving in the first place. Harebell. August the 15th, 1868. I had to rest twice on the way up, but the harebells were worth the resting. On the 3rd morning she retrieved the pressed forget-me-nots from between the pages of the natural history volume and found them adequately pressed, not perfect, not with the assurance of Catherine's 30 years of practice, but serviceable, the petals flattened and preserved, the color faded to the soft blue-gray that all the book's blue flowers had faded to across the years of keeping. She carried them to the library. She sat for a long time in the armchair with the book open on the blank first back page and the pressed forget-me-nots in her hand, and thought about what she was doing and what it meant and whether it was the right thing, and found that she did not have a final answer to any of these questions, and that the absence of a final answer was perhaps simply the honest condition of doing something that no one had asked her to do, and that no one had specifically told her not to do, the condition of acting in the gap between permission and prohibition that was, she had come to understand, the space in which much of her life had necessarily occurred. She thought about the forget-me-nots at their peak week, going to seed now, the dense blue already thinning. She thought about blank pages. She placed the flower on the page and fixed it there with the careful adhesive she had found in the library desk drawer, apparently kept there for exactly this purpose. She picked up the pen. She wrote. In handwriting she tried to make careful and small and unhurried, though she was aware that no amount of care would make it resemble Catherine's 30-year settled hand. Forget-me-not. May the 14th, 1875, from Catherine's corner near the bank. I have been here 1 week. I did not expect to feel at home so soon. Perhaps home is not a place you find. Perhaps it is a place that finds you when you are finally still enough to be found. She read it back. It was true, as true as she could make it in the limited space and with the limited certainty available to someone who had been in a place for only a week and was therefore necessarily working with preliminary rather than settled material. She thought of Catherine's early entries, the 1838 and 1839 and 1841s, and how different they were from the entries of the 1860s, the difference between someone beginning to learn a practice and someone who has been practicing for 20 years. She was at the beginning. The note reflected that. She closed the book. She did not replace it in the drawer, but sat with it on her lap for some minutes, in the afternoon light through the library's 3 windows, with the garden visible beyond the glass in its mid-May state, the roses beginning to open now, the wisteria finished, the forget-me-nots in Catherine's corner past their peak, the whole garden proceeding through its season with the unhurried purposefulness that she was coming to understand as May's particular character, everything happening in the right order, nothing rushed, nothing delayed beyond what the weather and the soil and the seed required. She thought about what she had done. She had added herself to Catherine Ashworth's book, had placed her own flower and her own note in the space after Catherine's final entry, in the blank pages that had been waiting, without anyone having explicitly invited her to do so since September of 1868. She did not know whether this was right. She thought it probably was, or probably was not wrong, which was the closest she could come to certainty in the matter. She had tried to match, in the note, the quality of honesty she had found in all of Catherine's entries, not the honesty of confession, which was something else, but the honesty of accurate description, of saying what was true, rather than what was impressive or appropriate or properly modest. I did not expect to feel at home so soon. This was true. She had not expected it. She had expected what her previous positions had provided, adequacy, professional competence on her own part, and the households, the managed coexistence of a person in a space that was not theirs. She had not expected in 1 week to have a corner she returned to every afternoon, and a book she read with genuine attention, and a garden she was learning name by name, and 2 children whose particular natures she was beginning to find genuinely interesting. She had not expected any of this. She was uncertain, as she sat in the library with the afternoon proceeding around her, whether she would have chosen differently about accepting the position if she had known what it would offer. She thought she would not have chosen differently. She thought she would have come anyway. She told Mrs. Crane what she had done, because it seemed right to do so, Mrs. Crane being the person who had most directly connected her to the book's existence and to its meaning, and because telling her felt less like reporting in action and more like completing a circuit that Mrs. Crane had, perhaps inadvertently, opened. She found her in the kitchen garden in the late afternoon, inspecting the early lettuces with the authoritative attention she brought to all domestic details, and said, simply, that she had added an entry to Mrs. Catherine's book. Mrs. Crane did not turn immediately. She looked at the lettuces for a moment more in the considering way she had, and then turned and looked at Florence with the expression that Florence had come to understand as her way of receiving significant information, not surprised, not approving or disapproving, simply attending. "What did you press?" she asked. "Forget-me-nots," Florence said, from the corner. Mrs. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a quality in her voice that Florence would not have called emotion, but that was clearly something that was adjacent to it. She would have liked that, I think. Florence did not know what to say to this, so she said nothing, which seemed, in the silence that followed, to be the right choice. Mrs. Crane looked back at the lettuces. They had not been the reason for her presence in the kitchen garden, Florence suspected, or not the only reason. She had the quality of someone who had come outside not for any single purpose, but simply to be in the place that was most completely hers, the way a person sometimes needs to stand in a familiar space in order to think about an unfamiliar thing. "Did she know you well?" Florence asked after a minute. Mrs. Crane considered this. "I knew her well enough to understand her," she said, "which is not the same as knowing someone completely. She knew her garden and her book. I knew the house and the household. We understood each other's work, which is a kind of knowing." "Was she happy?" Florence asked. Reading the book, it was difficult to tell. Happy seemed too simple a word for what the notes suggested. Mrs. Crane was quiet for long enough that Florence wondered if the question had been too direct. Then she said, "I think she was satisfied," which is not the same thing and probably harder to achieve. Florence thought about this. Satisfied, the word Catherine had used in a different form in some of the middle entries, the quality of someone who had made a life and found it sufficient, not despite its ordinary size, but partly because of it. She asked one more thing, because it had been in her mind since the conversation about the blank pages. "Did you know she left them, the blank pages at the back?" Mrs. Crane looked at her steadily. "I did," she said. "I looked at the book once, after she died. I noticed the blank pages. I put the book back in the drawer and left it there." She paused. "I thought someone would eventually understand what to do with them." Florence looked at the kitchen garden around them, the early lettuces, the bean frames, the established rows of herbs that lined the far wall. Everything here was in order, maintained, attended to, the result of many years of consistent care rather than any single dramatic intervention. She thought about blank pages and forget-me-nots and the particular kind of home that finds you when you are still enough to be found. She thanked Mrs. Crane and walked back to the house through the low gold of the May evening. May deepened into its third week, and the garden deepened with it. The roses came fully open. She learned their names from Mrs. Bond, Penn, who provided them with the same economical precision she brought to all botanical information. "This one is a damask. This is the old white. This is the climber your grandmother planted in 1832. The last remark was directed, Florence realized, at Eliza, who had joined them on this particular afternoon walk around the rose beds, having appeared from nowhere, as Eliza frequently did, with the quality of someone who considered the grounds of Greywood Hall to be entirely public as far as her own movements were concerned. Eliza was interested in the roses in the way she was interested in everything, sharply, briefly, the interest burning hot and moving on quickly, though she retained what she had learned. Thomas, who had also appeared, was more methodical, asking Mrs. Bond, Penn to repeat names he had not caught, and writing them in his own small notebook, a practice he had apparently adopted in imitation of Florence's notebook, which she found both touching and slightly mortifying. She had added 3 more entries to the book by the end of the 3rd week. She had pressed with increasing confidence and found that her results were improving. Not Catherine's 30 years of practice, but something less uncertain than the first attempt. She had begun to understand the particular logic of pressing, the relationship between a flower's water content and its likely success, the importance of timing in relation to the flower's own peak, the way certain structures pressed more cleanly than others. She had written the notes with the same care she had tried to bring to the first one, trying each time to find the accurate thing rather than the impressive thing, to describe what was actually true rather than what sounded like it ought to be. Wild Rose, May the 19th, 1875. From the hedge beside the east lane, where it grows over the wall in long arching canes. Thomas showed me this one. He found it without knowing its name, which he now knows. I find I am learning things from the children as often as I am teaching them, which seems like the right way around for everyone. Red Campion, May the 22nd, 1875. From the meadow bank, first one I have found on my own without anyone pointing it out. I was quite pleased with myself, and then thought about Catherine finding harebells on the high moor above Coldmoor and resting twice on the way up, and decided that self-congratulation at identifying a flower in a meadow was perhaps not entirely warranted. Herb Robert, May the 25th, 1875. From the kitchen garden wall, growing in the cracks of the stone. Mrs. Fenn says it is a weed, which she says with the particular resignation of someone who has long made peace with a plant's presence by reclassifying it. I am not sure the distinction between weed and flower is as clear as gardeners like to believe. She read these back in the quiet of the library after writing them and found them, on balance, honest, which was the only standard she had applied, the only one that seemed, after reading Catherine's 30 years, to be the right one. The light through the library windows lasted later each evening now, the long May days stretching toward June with a quality of generosity she had not experienced in London, where the long evenings of summer felt like they had been negotiated rather than simply given. She sat in the armchair with the book on the table beside her and looked at the garden in the long light and thought that she was, without having set out to be, beginning to know this place. On an evening in the 4th week, Florence stayed in the library past her usual time. She had not meant to. She had come in the afternoon as she always did, read for an hour, made one entry, a spray of cow parsley from the lane, pressed the previous day and now properly flat, the lacy white head preserved with a fidelity she was finding increasingly reliable, and had intended to go up to dress for supper, and instead had simply remained, the May evening too generous with its light to justify going indoors when she was already indoors, the garden visible through the 3 windows, too particular in its evening quality to leave without having properly received it. This was, she recognized, a new way of being in a place. She had always been, by necessity, efficiently present. She had never had the luxury of remaining anywhere beyond the time allotted to it, had always been aware of the next task and the one after that, had organized her interior life around a series of obligations that she had generally met with adequate grace. She was still doing this. She was a governess. Her mornings were structured and her afternoon freedom was real but bounded. But within the freedom she was finding something she had not previously known to look for, which was the capacity to simply be somewhere, to allow a place to make its full impression, rather than moving on before it had finished. She thought about Catherine, who had clearly cultivated this capacity across decades of living in the same house. The book's entries were full of it. The patience to wait for a flower to reach exactly the right state for pressing, the attention to notice things other people passed without remark, the willingness to return again and again to the same places and find them different each time. Mrs. Ashworth appeared in the library doorway at 7:30. Florence had met Margaret Ashworth for luncheon on the first day and had, in the 2 weeks since, exchanged brief morning conversations and the occasional afternoon word in passing, the relationship of employer and employee conducted with the pleasant civility that both parties seemed to find sufficient. Margaret Ashworth was a practical woman in her late 30s who appeared to find the management of a household and 2 children adequately demanding without requiring additional complexity, and who treated Florence with the easy respect of someone who had engaged a competent professional and found her competence confirmed. She looked at Florence in the armchair with a question in her expression that was not quite a question, and then at the book on the table beside her, and said, with the directness that Florence was coming to understand as her characteristic mode. "Is that Catherine's book?" Florence said that it was. Margaret Ashworth came further into the room and sat in the other armchair with the ease of someone sitting in a room that is hers, and looked at the book with the expression of someone who has known something exists for a long time without examining it directly. "I knew she kept something," she said. "Gerald's mentioned it. She never showed anyone though." She looked at Florence. "You've been reading it?" "Every afternoon," Florence said, and then, after a moment, "I've added to it 3 entries. I should have asked permission first." Margaret Ashworth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, not unkindly, "Why would you ask my permission? It was hers. She did not say it was the family's or the house's. She kept it for herself." Florence thought about this. "She left blank pages," she said. Margaret Ashworth looked at the window where the evening garden was doing something complicated and beautiful with the last of the light. "Yes," she said, "I suppose she did." Margaret Ashworth came to the library the following afternoon. Florence was already there, in the armchair with the book, and Margaret took the other armchair with the natural ease of someone who had sat in it many times, and they read together for a while, Florence reading the book and Margaret reading a novel she had brought. The library comfortable around them in the way of rooms that have always been used for exactly this purpose. After perhaps half an hour, Margaret closed her novel and said, not as though beginning a conversation, but as though continuing one that had been running in parallel to the reading, "Tell me what you have found in it." Florence told her. She began with the Hawthorne entry, the first one, May 1838. The year did not begin well, and the Hawthorne did not ask permission, and worked forward through the entries that had struck her most, reading some of them aloud from the book, summarizing others. Margaret listened without interrupting, with the quality of someone receiving something they had known existed but had not, until now, allowed themselves to fully consider. She knew about the forget-me-nots, she said, when Florence reached the 1846 entry. Gerald mentioned once that his mother had planted them specially. He did not mention the rest. She did not show the book to anyone, Florence said. Mrs. Crane said so. Margaret looked at the window. No, she said. She wouldn't have. She was a very private person in certain ways. She was very present. She was in the house, and in the garden, and in the children's lives, Gerald's life, and Edmund's. But there were parts of her that she maintained separately, and I think everyone who knew her understood that maintaining those parts separately was how she managed to be so fully present in everything else. Florence thought about this, the privacy as a kind of resource rather than a kind of withdrawal, the kept apart interior life enabling rather than diminishing the outward life. "When did you come to Greywood Hall?" she asked. Margaret calculated. 62, she said. "I married Gerald in 62. She was here for 6 more years. I liked her very much, which is not always the case with mothers-in-law, and I think she liked me in the careful way she liked most people, which was attentively and without demanding anything in return." She paused. "I knew about the garden," she said. "I knew she pressed flowers. She did it openly enough. She'd bring them in from the garden and press them in the front hall. Anyone could see. What I didn't know was the book, the notes. She kept those entirely to herself." She looked at Florence. "How did you find it?" "The drawer was slightly open," Florence said. "I found it on my second day." Margaret looked at the table where the book now rested. "It's been in that drawer for 7 years, with the drawer slightly open," she said. "No one else found it." Florence was quiet. "Perhaps it was waiting," Margaret said. She said this with a slight self-consciousness, as though recognizing the sentiment as somewhat beyond her usual register, but she did not retract it. They sat for a while in the library with the book between them and the May afternoon proceeding outside the windows, and Florence felt, in the particular quality of the silence, that she was being given something, not the book itself, which was not Margaret's to give, but permission in some looser and more important sense, the permission of someone who had the authority to make her feel unwelcome and was choosing, instead, to make her feel otherwise. "She has 12 pages at the back," Florence said. "I've used 3 of them." Margaret looked at her. "Then keep going," she said simply, "as long as you're here." On a warm afternoon in the 5th week, Florence took the children into the garden with the specific purpose of teaching them to identify what was growing there. This had not been part of the original curriculum she had established for Eliza and Thomas, which was composed of the standard subjects a governess of her experience and their ages would reasonably address: English composition, arithmetic, French, history, geography, drawing. But she had found, across the weeks, that the children's interest in what she had been learning about the garden was genuine rather than polite, and she had come to believe that genuine interest, wherever it appeared, warranted following. She took them to Mrs. Fenn first, who received their presents with the particular expression she wore when faced with children she found acceptable, not warmth exactly, more the acknowledgement of potential, and who allowed them to follow her around the herb garden while she named things with the same economical precision she had brought to Florence's own early education. Thomas wrote everything down in the methodical way he had with any information he wished to retain. Eliza listened and asked questions, several of which Florence could not answer, and 2 of which Mrs. Fenn could not answer either, the questions being of the kind that required a botanist rather than a gardener, and which Mrs. Fenn acknowledged with the honest pragmatism of someone who understood the limits of her own knowledge and did not find them shameful. They went then to the meadow field beyond the kitchen garden, where Florence had been on several afternoons now with her own notebook, and she showed them the red campion she had pressed, the actual living plant, pointing to the ones still growing along the bank, and the herb Robert in the wall cracks, and the cow parsley that was just passing its peak along the lane hedge. Thomas pressed his hand against the stone wall where the herb Robert grew, feeling its rough texture, and said, "Why does it grow in stone?" "Because it's found something to hold on to," Florence said, which was not botanically precise, but seemed, standing at the wall with the small pink flowers in the cracks and the May afternoon around them, true in the way she was beginning to value truth, not complete, not scientific, but accurate to the actual experience of the thing. Eliza found a bee on a clover head and watched it with a patience Florence would not have predicted from her general character, standing very still for perhaps 3 minutes, while the bee completed its work and moved on, and then turning to Florence with the expression of someone who has just understood something. "Does everything know what it's doing?" she asked. Florence thought about this. "I think everything follows its own nature," she said, which might be the same thing. They walked back to the house in the long afternoon light, the children ahead of her arguing amicably about whether the bee knew it was making honey or simply did it without knowing, and Florence behind them with her notebook and the small growing list of things she had learned, and found herself thinking, as she had begun to think at quietest across these weeks, about what it might mean to stay, not permanently. She was a governess. Her position was by nature temporary, and she understood this with the same clarity with which she understood all professional realities. But the particular quality of being here, in this house and this garden and this May, with these children and Catherine's book and Mrs. Fenn and Mrs. Crane and the long evenings and the forget-me-nots going to seed in Catherine's corner, this specific, unrepeatable combination of things that was only available now and would not be exactly this again. She walked back to the house and thought about what it meant to be present for exactly the right week. By the end of the 5th week, she had 7 entries in the back of the book. She did not press every flower she found or learned. She had understood, reading Catherine's 30 years, that the book was not a comprehensive record, but a selective one, that what went in was what warranted going in, what carried sufficient weight of occasion or observation or feeling to justify the care of pressing and mounting and the more difficult care of finding accurate words for it. She pressed what she found herself returning to, what she thought about more than once, what she couldn't say in a single look and needed to stay with. Ox Eye Daisy, May the 29th, 1875. From the meadow field in the long grass where the mower hasn't been yet. Eliza made a chain of them this afternoon and put it around Thomas's neck, and he wore it for the rest of the garden walk as though it were entirely normal, which is the particular grace of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be self-conscious. I am trying to take note of these moments because I understand they are temporary. Ragged Robin, June the 2nd, 1875, from the wet ditch beside the East Lane. Pink, raggedly beautiful, exactly as named. Mrs. Fenn says it is less common than it used to be. I find I am moved by things being less common than they used to be in a way I did not expect to be moved before I came here. Meadow Cranesbill, June the 5th, 1875, from the upper field margin. Blue-purple, 5 petals, found by Thomas on a walk we took above the north pasture. He brought it back between his palms as though carrying something delicate and breakable, which it was, and which he understood without being told. She read these back each time she wrote them, applying the standard she had set herself from the beginning, not whether they were impressive, but whether they were true. She made small revisions occasionally, the way she had noticed Catherine making revisions, catching places where she had said something more or less than what was actually the case. She was not Catherine. She understood this clearly and without distress. She was 26 years old and had been in this house for 5 weeks and had no illusions about the difference between 5 weeks and 30 years of faithful practice. Catherine's entries had an assurance, a settled quality of observation that Florence's could not yet possess, not because she was less capable, but because she had not yet earned the quiet that comes from doing something for long enough that it becomes simply the form your attention naturally takes. Körper, Jungsinten. She was beginning in the way of all beginnings, imperfectly, with more uncertainty than she would have liked, with some entries that felt fully achieved and some that fell short, and the ongoing inability to predict in advance which would be which. She was beginning in a place that had not, until she arrived, known she was coming, and that had, across the 5 weeks of her being here, received her with the quiet, unhurried patience that she was increasingly understanding to be Greywood Hall's particular character. She closed the book after her 7th entry and replaced it in the drawer, partly closed, as she had always found it, the habit of slightly ajar maintained without her quite having made a decision to maintain it, as though her hands understood something about continuity that her conscious mind was still catching up with. She went to the window and looked out at the June garden, the May flowers largely finished now, the early roses still going but altered from their first week glory, the hawthorn blossom long gone from the hedges, the wisteria past, the garden in the settled fullness of early summer rather than the explosive promise of late spring. She was still finding things to press. She wrote to her previous employer in London at the beginning of the 6th week, not the institution where she had talked before this position, but the woman, Mrs. Hartley, who had given her the reference for Greywood Hall, who had known Florence for 3 years, and who was, in the careful, limited way of professional relationships, someone Florence considered a friend. The letter was not long. She described the house and the children and the garden and the position as she had found it after 5 weeks, with the same quality of careful accuracy she had been trying to apply to the book's entries, avoiding the impulse toward either enthusiasm or understatement that characterized most professional correspondence she had encountered. She said that the position was, in her current assessment, significantly better than her previous two, without being specific about what better meant in this instance, partly because she was still working out what better meant and did not trust herself to describe it accurately until she understood it more fully. At the end of the letter, she mentioned the book. She described it briefly: the pressed flowers, the 30 years of entries, the discovery of it in the library drawer, the conversations with Mrs. Crane and Mrs. Ashworth. She did not describe the blank pages or her own additions, partly because she had not yet decided what she thought about those additions and did not want to commit them to correspondence before she had, and partly because the additions felt, for the moment, too new and too tentative to put into words for someone who had not seen the book. She mentioned Catherine Ashworth's name and the dates of the entries, 1838 to 1868, and said that reading someone's 30-year private record of what they had noticed and thought about and found worth preserving was an unexpectedly significant experience, and that she had found herself thinking, across the weeks of reading it, about what it meant to pay close attention to one place for a very long time. She sealed and posted the letter and walked back from the village post office through the early June morning, which had the particular quality of a day that had decided from the outset to be fully itself, warm, clear, the light at 9 o'clock already carrying the warmth of high summer even though June had barely begun, the hedgerows fully in their summer green, the hawthorn blossom memory now, the cow parsley finished, everything else proceeding with the unhurried confidence of a season that knows exactly where it is going. She found Thomas waiting at the lane gate, which he was not supposed to be. The children were not permitted to go beyond the garden without an adult, a rule Florence enforced with some consistency, and Thomas tested with some regularity, not defiantly, but with the quality of someone who simply forgets that rules exist when something more immediately interesting has presented itself. He was looking at something in the hedge. "I found something," he said, when she reached him. He pointed, with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb the object of his interest. "A nest. Look." She looked, bending carefully. A small cup of dried grass and moss, woven into the hedge with structural expertise, containing 3 pale blue eggs spotted with brown. She identified neither the bird nor the egg, though she made a mental note to ask Mrs. Penn. She stood very still beside Thomas for a long moment, both of them looking at the eggs in the nest in the June morning. "What do we do?" Thomas asked in a quiet voice. "We look," Florence said, "and then we leave it alone." He nodded. They looked for another moment. Then they walked back to the house for the morning's lessons. June brought the longest light of the year, and Florence found herself spending more and more of the evening hours outdoors, not walking exactly, though she walked, but simply being in the garden in the particular way she had learned from Catherine's book and from her own weeks of practice, present rather than purposeful, attending rather than achieving. She had understood something over the course of these 6 weeks that she had not expected to understand when she had stepped off the train at Harrogate in the first week of May, that the attention required to truly see a place, to learn it, rather than merely visit it, was a specific capacity that had to be developed rather than simply exercised, and that the development of it took time, not dramatic time, not years necessarily, but the particular time of repeated return, of going back to the same places and finding them different and finding yourself different in them. She went to Catherine's corner most evenings when the weather permitted, which in this June it usually did. The forget-me-nots were gone now, as Mrs. Penn had predicted, the plants gone to seed, the dense blue entirely absent, replaced by the leggy stalks and small seed heads of something spent. She had learnt enough, across these weeks, to understand that this was the right conclusion for the season, and not a loss. The seeds already fallen and waiting in the soil for the following year's bloom. But she missed the blue, missed the particular dense colour that had greeted her in the first week, and that she had understood only as it was leaving. She pressed cow parsley in the 4th week, and elderflower in the 5th, and yellow rattle in the 6th, and wrote notes about each of them that she read back with the critical attention she had developed and found, on balance, honest if not always complete. She had not, she realized in the quiet of a June evening, been complete in anything she had written. Catherine's early entries had not been complete either. She had returned to them, added to them, revised them across subsequent years as she understood more fully what she had been trying to say. Florence had only 6 weeks of material. She was, in that sense, still in the beginning of a process whose middle and end she could not see from where she was standing. She found she was comfortable with this. Mrs. Crane came into the garden as the evening light was reaching its most extravagant, the full-length June light that lasted until past 9, the sky still pale in the north, the garden in a state of golden suspension that she had come to understand as the particular gift of this latitude, unavailable in the compressed light of London, and stood for a moment, looking at the garden with the expression of someone for whom this view had been part of the daily landscape for 30 years, and remained, apparently worth standing still for. She said, without looking at Florence, "Mrs. Catherine used to say that the garden at this time of evening was the truest argument for staying anywhere." Florence looked at the garden. "Why?" "Because it is difficult to want to leave something you can see this clearly," Mrs. Crane said. She went back inside. Florence stayed where she was. She thought about the nature of clarity, the particular clear seeing that comes not from distance or objectivity, but from sustained, close, repeated attention, the way a thing revealed itself, over time, to someone who kept returning to it. She looked at the garden until the light finally went, and then she went inside. In the 7th week she found, in the library, on a rainy afternoon when the garden was inaccessible, and the children were occupied with drawing exercises she had set them to manage independently, a stack of letters in the back of the library desk's lower drawer. She had been looking for a larger sheet of blotting paper, and had opened the drawer without expecting anything in particular, and found the letters, perhaps 30 of them, tied with a frayed brown ribbon, in the same small, careful handwriting she now recognized immediately. She sat for a moment with the bundle in her lap without opening it. Then she put it back in the drawer, exactly as she had found it, and went to find Mrs. Ashworth. Margaret was in the morning room with her own correspondence, and she looked up when Florence came in with the question in her expression that Florence had come to read as her general state of reception, interested, open, waiting to see what was needed. "There are letters," Florence said, "in the lower drawer of the library desk. They look like Mrs. Catherine's. I thought you should know, in case you didn't." Margaret put down her pen and looked at Florence steadily for a moment. Then she said, "I did know. She left them there." Florence waited. "She left everything where it was," Margaret said. "The book in the main drawer, the letters in the lower drawer, her gardening notes in the greenhouse potting shed. She didn't gather them up or sort them. She just left them where they lived. I've never been entirely sure whether this was intention or simply the way things were when she died, and no one thought to change it. Florence thought about this, the possibility that the apparent arrangement had simply been the natural state of things, the book in the drawer where it had always been kept, the letters in the drawer where they had always been stored. No deliberate message, but simply the shape of a life that had not been cleaned up after itself. "Did you read them?" Florence asked. Margaret looked at her with a brief, candid expression. "No," she said, "I didn't feel it was mine to read." Florence thought about the book, which she had read, which had been, in some sense she was still working out, given to her by the condition of the drawer and the blank pages and the particular quality of the entry for the forget-me-nots that had seemed, even on first reading, to be addressed to someone rather than simply recorded. "I don't think I should read the letters," she said. The book felt different. There were blank pages. The letters are private in a different way. Margaret looked at her. "I think that's right," she said. "I think that's the correct distinction." They sat for a moment in the morning room with the rain on the windows and the household quiet around them, and Florence thought about the difference between what is left open and what is left closed, between what is waiting to be continued and what is waiting simply to be left as it is, and understood that the distinction, while sometimes clear, was not always, and that the fact of a thing's existence was not, by itself, permission to engage with it. She had understood this about the letters immediately. She had not understood it quite so immediately about the book, but she understood now why the book had been different. The blank pages, yes, but also something in the entries themselves, the quality of a voice that had been keeping its own counsel for 30 years and might have wondered, at the end, whether it was enough to have kept it only for oneself. She went back to the library and sat with the rain on the windows and the book on her lap, and read an entry from 1853 she had not fully appreciated on the first pass through. "Dog Rose, June the 17th, from the lane hedge, blooming late this year. I used to want things to arrive on schedule. I have learned, in 15 years of this garden, that they always arrive when they mean to." The 8th week of her time at Greywood Hall brought a spell of cooler weather. Not cold, not the kind of cold that announced a change of season, but a moderation, the temperature settling back from June's early warmth into something more typical. The sky overcast for 3 days running, the rain intermittent but present. She pressed meadow buttercup and white clover and the first early elderberry flowers she found on the sheltered bank near the kitchen garden wall, and wrote notes about each of them that were, on rereading, the most settled of what she had yet produced, not because the feelings in them were more resolved, but because the writing of them had arrived at something closer to the quality she had been moving towards since the first entry. "White Clover, June the 18th, 1875. From the meadow field, the part that doesn't get cut. The bees were everywhere in it today, working with the particular urgency of creatures who understand that good forage is finite. I stood in it for perhaps 10 minutes watching them, and felt the particular pleasure of witnessing something done very well by something that knows exactly what it is doing." She read this back and found she had nothing to revise. This had not happened before. All previous entries had required some adjustment in the rereading, some place where she had said more or less than was accurate. This one said what it said, and what it said was true. She did not make much of this to herself, understanding that single reliable entries did not constitute settled practice, and that the next one would likely require revision. But she allowed herself, quietly, a moment of recognition that something was happening across these weeks. that she was not the same observer she had been on the first day she had opened the book's drawer and read about Hawthorne in 1838. The rain gave way on the fourth day to a clear, bright June morning, of the kind that arrives after several grey days, with the quality of something that has been decided upon, and Florence took the children to the top of the north field where Thomas had found the nest to check on the eggs. They had hatched. The nest was empty, the shells gone, the birds, identified by Mrs. Fenn as song thrushes, which Florence had then looked up in the natural history volume in the schoolroom, already dispersed into the hedge, impossible to find now, living the independent lives that had begun in the small cup of grass and moss that had spent 3 weeks in the June hedge. Thomas was pleased in the uncomplicated way of someone whose expectation of a good outcome has been confirmed. Eliza was briefly disappointed that there were no longer birds to look at, and then, with her characteristic speed of recovery, interested instead in what they would do next. Florence looked at the empty nest for a moment, the perfect small architecture of it, still intact even though its purpose was complete, and thought about Catherine's entry for the forget-me-nots, a plant that knows what it wants and proceeds toward it without requiring your continued management. She thought about the various things she had come to Greywood Hall without knowing she was looking for, and the ways in which the place had, week by week, without requiring her conscious management of the process, been quietly providing them. She thought, in the long blue June morning on the top of the north field, that she was genuinely glad she had come on a Sunday afternoon in the 9th week. Her Sundays were her own, as Mrs. Ashworth had specified from the beginning. Florence walked from Greywood Hall to the village and back, a route she had not previously taken, choosing it partly for the exercise and partly for the simple reason that she had not yet walked that particular lane, and found she was becoming interested in lanes she had not yet walked. The village of Greywood was small. A church, a handful of shops, a public house, a post office, the houses gathered around the small triangular green in the manner of Yorkshire villages that had grown around a common space and had remained gathered there for centuries without particular reason to rearrange themselves. She walked through it slowly, looking at it with the quality of attention she had been developing across the 9 weeks, seeing it as a particular place rather than a generic small Yorkshire village. She bought stamps at the post office and spoke briefly with the postmistress, a brisk woman of about 50, who knew who Florence was, the governess at Greywood Hall, which was apparently a piece of information the village had already absorbed, and who asked about the children with the particular interest of someone for whom the hall represented a relevant piece of the local social landscape. Florence answered what she could and did not answer what felt private, finding the balance, as she generally did, more by instinct than by deliberate calculation. She walked home by a different route, taking the lane that ran along the top of the park wall, which gave her a view across the park to the south face of the house and, from the right angle, a portion of the walled garden. She could see, from this vantage, the corner where the forget-me-nots had been, Catherine's corner, with the bench. From here the bench was small but distinct, the stone a pale grey against the darker grey of the wall, and the corner itself was green now, the forget-me-not plants gone to their summer state of stalky and undramatic, the blue entirely absent until next May. She thought about what it meant that next May would come, that the forget-me-nots would come back, as they always came back, that Catherine's corner would be blue again in the 3rd week of May 1876, and that she might or might not be here to see it, depending on what the next months brought, depending on whether the Ashworths wished to retain her and whether she wished to stay, and whether the particular combination of things that had made these 9 weeks what they had been could be sustained into a second year, or whether it was, as such things sometimes were, specific to a particular arrival in a particular season. She did not know the answer to this. She understood that not knowing was the honest condition, and that the alternatives, knowing too soon or pretending to know, were less useful than the uncertainty itself, which at least had the virtue of being accurate. She walked back to the house and came in through the kitchen garden gate, as she often did, and stood for a moment in the kitchen garden with the late afternoon around her, the beans beginning to climb their frames, the lettuces Mrs. Crane had inspected now full grown, the herbs in their established rows, releasing their smells in the warm June air. She went inside and up to her room and wrote a long entry in her own small notebook. Not for the book, this one, but for herself, the ongoing record she had been keeping since the first week, the accumulation of names and observations and questions she had not yet answered, the log of someone learning something they had not known they were going to learn. She read it back and found it honest. June moved into its final week with the quality of something drawing toward a conclusion without announcing the conclusion. The days still long, the garden still full, the light still generous, but some quality of the month's particularity beginning to prepare for the transition into July. Florence had been at Greywood Hall for 10 weeks. She counted them at the library table one afternoon, with the book open beside her, working backward from the current date to her arrival, and found the number both larger and smaller than she had expected. Larger in the sense that 10 weeks was substantial, a proper span of time in which things had occurred and changed and developed. Smaller in the sense that it still felt, in some ways, like not very long at all, like not enough time to have properly learned what she was learning. She had 12 entries in the back of the book now. She read them in order, beginning with the forget-me-nots, and found, reading them as a sequence, something she had not fully perceived while writing them individually, a progression, however tentative, from the quality of the first entry to the quality of the most recent ones. Not dramatic, not the difference between novice and expert, but the difference between someone who has just begun attending to a place and someone who has been attending to it for 10 weeks, which was the difference between looking carefully and beginning to see. She thought about Catherine's book, the entries from 1838, when Catherine had been 32, 6 years older than Florence was now, had had a similar quality to Florence's earliest entries, honest, clear-eyed, but working harder than the later entries, making more visible the effort of the observation. By the 1850s, the entries had the quality of someone for whom this kind of attention was simply how they moved through the world, the observation no longer requiring deliberate cultivation because it had become the form their perception naturally took. Florence understood she was at the beginning of something that, if she continued it, would take years to mature into what Catherine had achieved. She also understood that the beginning was not a lesser state than the maturity, that the early entries were valuable precisely as early entries, the record of first encounters and initial understandings that later knowledge would refine, but could not replace. She added an entry that afternoon, the last of June she found, rather than the beginning of July, had produced a flower she had been wanting to find for weeks, which was simply the ordinary common poppy in the lane verge, growing where the mowing had not yet reached, a red so purely and specifically itself that she had stood looking at it for several minutes before collecting it. Field poppy, June the 26th, 1875, from the lane verge past the north gate where the grass is long, red in a way that makes other reds seem approximate. I picked it knowing it would probably not survive the pressing well. The petals are fragile and thin, but it seemed worth trying. Some things are worth attempting even when the likelihood of full success is low. She read it back and found it true. She closed the book and replaced it in the drawer, slightly ajar, as she had always found it, and went upstairs to dress for supper with the particular settled feeling of someone who has, in the course of an ordinary afternoon, done something small and right. Margaret Ashworth asked her, in the first week of July, whether she would consider staying a second year. She asked it with the directness that characterized everything she did, not making it into more than it was, not wrapping it in the particular kind of social management that would have made the question feel like an obligation. She simply asked, over a cup of tea in the morning room, noting that the children were doing well, that the household had settled comfortably with Florence in it, and that she would like to know, when Florence had thought about it, whether a second year was something Florence would want. Florence said she would think about it and give an answer within the week. She thought about it for 3 days, which was not as long as it might have been, given the extent of what the question involved. She thought about it in the schoolroom, and in the library, and in Catherine's corner, which was green and stalk-like now in early July, the forget-me-nots entirely over, the bench warm in the summer sun, and entirely absent of the blue that had greeted her first week. She thought about London. She thought about the 2 previous positions, both adequate, both left without particular regret. She thought about the positions she might find after this one, other houses, other children, the same general category of work in different particular versions, each one bringing its own small education and its own particular ending. She thought about the book. She had 13 entries now, each one belonging to a specific flower, from a specific place on a specific day, each one an accumulation of attention that could only have been made here, in this place, in this spring and early summer, by the particular person she was becoming through the making of them. She thought about what it would mean to leave these entries as the entirety of her contribution, 13 pages against Catherine's 230, the beginning of something set down without the middle or the end. She thought about what it would mean to stay long enough for a second spring. She went to Mrs. Crane on the 3rd day, not to ask for advice. Mrs. Crane was not, in Florence's understanding of her, a person who gave advice, but simply to think aloud in her presence, which she had found, across the weeks, to be one of Mrs. Crane's more useful qualities. She said, without preamble, because Mrs. Crane preferred directness, "I'm thinking about staying a second year." Mrs. Crane looked at her with the deliberate expression. "That would be good for the children," she said. Florence thought about the children, and about the garden, and about the book, and about the question of what good for the children and good for herself looked like when they pointed in the same direction. She thought about Catherine's entry from 1843, the one with the small revision, "Read this in 45, and thought how ungenerous it is. They were not very loud. I was simply tired and gave it the wrong name." She thought about the discipline of accuracy, of saying what was actually true rather than what was convenient or impressive or properly modest, of finding, in the difficult space between the available words and the actual experience, the ones that fit. She thought about the blank pages remaining in the book. There were 9 of them. She went to Margaret Ashworth the following morning and said that she would stay. July arrived with the fullness that July always brought to Yorkshire. The countryside at its deepest green, the hedgerows thick, the lanes almost tunnels of vegetation, the moors above the valley showing the first faint suggestion of the purple that would come fully in August when the heather opened. Florence had been at Greywood Hall for 12 weeks. She pressed meadowsweet in the first week of July, the creamy flower heads she had read about in Catherine's 1841 entry, the smell of which was exactly as Catherine had described. the smell of something that has decided to be itself completely. And she wrote about the smell, and about reading Catherine's entry, and about finding the meadowsweet herself. Finally, after several weeks of knowing it was somewhere in the hedgerows without being able to locate it, and found, writing the note, that she was writing about multiple things at once: the flower, the finding, the book, the practice of finding things in the real landscape that she had first encountered in someone else's words. She was becoming something she had not had a word for when she arrived, and was only now beginning to find words for. Not a botanist. She did not have the knowledge and did not claim it. Not a naturalist. She lacked the systematic training. Something closer to what Catherine had been, an attentive resident of a specific place, someone who was learning it intimately and without any particular professional purpose, for the reason that it was here and that she was here, and that this combination created an obligation of a certain kind, the obligation simply to notice. Mrs. Fenn taught her, across the July afternoons when the weeding or the pruning or the deadheading allowed conversation, how to understand the garden's seasonal rhythms, what came after what needed doing when, the particular logic of an English garden's year. Florence listened with the same concentrated attention she had brought to the book, understanding that this was another kind of record, oral rather than written, the accumulated knowledge of 50 years of working this specific ground. She added an entry about the garden, the first one that was not about a specific flower, but about the practice itself. July the 7th, 1875. No single flower today, or rather too many, the garden in its July fullness, everything at once. I have been thinking about what it means to learn a place. Mrs. Fenn knows this garden the way I know how to read, not a skill she exercises, but a condition she inhabits. I am not there. I am learning to read, still finding out what the letters are. I understand this will take years. I find I am willing to take them. She read this back and did not revise it. She pressed the meadowsweet that evening in the manner she had developed across the weeks, the doubled paper, the heavy book, the 3-day wait that she had found, through iteration, to be the right interval for this type of flower. She mounted it carefully, with the adhesive she had now handled enough times that the application had become competent, and arranged it on the page with the attention to presentation that Catherine's specimens had taught her by example. Then she sat with the pen for a while before writing the note, which was the part that always required the most time, the part where the accuracy or inaccuracy of what she was trying to say became apparent. She wrote about the smell because it was the most immediately distinctive thing about the meadowsweet, and because Catherine had written about it too, and because writing about the same quality in the same place across a gap of 34 years felt, in some way she was still working out, like the right kind of conversation. She made the 14th entry on the 14th of July, which was coincidence. She had not planned it, had not counted toward it, but which she noticed when she wrote the date in the small, careful hand she was developing across the back pages of the book. The flower was a common spotted orchid, found growing in the rough grass at the edge of the north field near the wall, a place she had passed many times, but which she had not known to look at carefully until Thomas had stopped and crouched in the grass on one of their afternoon walks and pointed, with the kind of focused attention he brought to things he had decided to be interested in, at the pink-purple spike of flowers rising from the long grass. She had not known what it was. She had photographed it in her memory and asked Mrs. Fenn the following morning, and Mrs. Fenn had told her, with unusual animation, the orchid was, apparently, one of the things even Mrs. Fenn found worth animation, that common spotted orchids were exactly that, common, but that common did not mean unremarkable, and that it was a matter of looking for them, and that the fact that they were there at all, in the rough grass of the north field, was a matter of the field not being managed too closely, of there being space in the management for things to grow that had not been specifically invited. She pressed it with particular care, aware that orchids did not press as easily as the more tractable flowers she had been working with, and was gratified that the result was, if not perfect, recognizable, the delicate markings still faintly visible on the dried petals, the shape of the spike preserved. The note she wrote for it was the longest of the 14. Common Spotted Orchid, July the 14th, 1875, from the north field margin in the long grass beside the wall, found by Thomas, who stopped for it without knowing what it was, and waited patiently until I had looked at it properly, which is a quality of attention I am trying to learn from him. Mrs. Fenn says it grows where the ground has been left to its own intentions. I have been thinking, since she said this, about what it means to leave ground to its own intentions, what grows in the space that is not closely managed, not directed toward a specific purpose. I came here not knowing I was looking for anything in particular. I found things anyway. I think this is how it works. She read it back and sat with it for a long while without revising it, which was the closest she had come, in 14 entries, to being confident that she had said the right thing in the right way. She closed the book and replaced it in the drawer. She went to the window and looked out at the July garden, which was doing what July gardens did, proceeding with the fullness of its season, everything at once, the particular abundant indifference of a garden that does not need to be watched in order to continue. She watched it anyway. She had been at Greywood Hall for just over 3 months. She had 14 entries in the back of a book that had 30 years of someone else's careful attention in its front pages. She had agreed to stay for a second year. She knew the names of 47 plants, which was 46 more than she had known on the morning she had stepped off the train at Harrogate into air she had not expected to be as it was. She thought, I am still at the beginning. She thought, good. And that is where we leave Florence Wray tonight. In the library at Greywood Hall, where the July evening is still and warm, and the last of the light is doing something unhurried with the garden beyond the 3 tall windows, touching the rose beds and the herb border, and the corner where the forget-me-nots will come back, as they always come back, in the 3rd week of next May. The book is in the drawer. The drawer is slightly ajar, as Florence found it, as it had been since September of 1868, as it may be for some time to come. Inside, in order, the 30 years of Catherine Ashworth's careful record, from the hawthorn of May 1838 to the harebell of August 1868, and then the gap of the blank pages, and then, in a different hand and a newer ink, the 14 entries that have accumulated across the spring and early summer of 1875 in the particular unhurried way of things that are made carefully, one at a time, without any particular purpose beyond the making. The garden holds its July warmth in the manner of gardens in their fullest season, the heat stored in the stone paths and the thick borders and the south-facing wall, released slowly through the evening, the scent of the herbs strongest now that the air has cooled, lavender and rosemary, and something Florence does not yet have a name for, but will, given time. The children are in bed. Mrs. Crane has finished her evening rounds and gone to her own rooms. Mrs. Fenn will return tomorrow morning, as she returns every morning, to continue the work that has no single completion but simply continues, season after season, until the person doing it is no longer doing it and someone else begins. Florence is upstairs in her room with its south-facing window, writing in her own notebook. The small private record that runs parallel to the book's entries, less formal, less finished, the raw material of attention before it has been shaped into something worth preserving. She is writing about the orchid, and about Thomas, and about what it means to find things in spaces that have not been too closely managed. Sleep now. The book will keep through the night in the drawer where it has kept through many nights, the pressed flowers within it unchanged, the notes unchanged. Catherine's 30 years of honest attention and Florence's 14 careful entries held together between the dark green covers, the oldest flower still holding its shape after 37 years of being correctly preserved, the newest entry still fresh in ink that dried only this afternoon. Outside the library windows, the July garden is entirely itself in the darkness, the roses closed for the night, the herbs still fragrant, the stone bench in Catherine's corner, pale in the last of the evening light, the ground around it green and stalk-like, and waiting for the seeds already there, already present, already knowing exactly what they will become when the time is right. The drawer is slightly ajar. The blank pages are waiting. There are 8 of them left. Rest well.